The day had started as it always did for Adana, with a worn-out bag carrying a few bread rolls and cheap medicine, her tired hands clutching whatever she had begged for the night before. Every morning was a battle, a hustle against hunger and despair, all for the sake of her frail mother who lay coughing under the ragged shade of the bridge. Life had taught Adana to fight for scraps, to stretch every coin, and to ignore the pitying or judgmental stares of strangers passing by. But this morning would not be ordinary. This morning something happened that not even her wildest imagination could have drawn for her. A murmur swept across the crowded underpass, and soon the air was filled with whispers and gasps. People turned their heads, eyes widening as a gleaming Rolls-Royce Phantom rolled to a smooth stop nearby. The sight of such a luxurious car in this dirty, forgotten corner of Lagos was almost unreal, like a diamond dropped in the mud. From its polished doors emerged a figure that needed no introduction. Johnson Okaffor, the 32-year-old billionaire, the powerful CEO of Johnson Autos, and the man whose very name was synonymous with wealth and influence. He was the face of ambition fulfilled, the dream of every aspiring businessman, and the fantasy of countless young women. Reporters wrote about him endlessly, society whispered about him, and yet here he was, stepping out of his world of chandeliers and gold staircases into the dust and noise of the underbridge. The crowd froze, unable to process the sight. Johnson was dressed in a tailored navy blue suit that hugged his tall frame, a golden wristwatch flashing like fire beneath the morning sun. He walked with calm, unhurried steps, but there was a purpose in his stride. Every eye followed him as he moved, yet his gaze was fixed firmly on one person, Adana. She stood there in her faded dress, thin from years of struggle, clutching the bread rolls as if they were treasure. Her lips parted in shock as he came, directly toward her, ignoring the murmurs, ignoring the honking of cars, ignoring the fingers pointing at him. Then came the moment no one could have predicted. Right there on the dusty, cracked pavement, Johnson Okaffor, the billionaire whose empire stretched across Nigeria, lowered himself onto one knee. A wave of astonishment swept through the crowd, people grabbing their phones to record, some shouting in disbelief. Johnson reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. When he opened it, the diamond inside glittered with a brilliance that seemed almost defiant against the dirt and shadows around them. His voice, usually steady and commanding in boardrooms, trembled slightly as he spoke. "Adana," he said, every word carrying the weight of sincerity. "Will you marry me? Leave this life behind. Let me take you away from here. Let's start anew. Let me give you the future you deserve." The underbridge erupted with noise, whispers, exclamations, laughter, shock. Some scoffed, some cried. Some could barely believe what they were witnessing. A billionaire proposing to a homeless girl. Yet there he was, kneeling at her feet, waiting for her answer. For a long moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Adana's chest rose and fell as if she were standing underwater, struggling to breathe. She stared at the sparkling diamond, then at the man kneeling before her, the billionaire every woman in Lagos dreamed of. Around them, the whispers of the crowd grew louder, rippling like waves crashing against rocks. Some people laughed in disbelief, others shouted encouragement, and many simply stood frozen, their phones raised, capturing every second. To them, this was history in the making. But to Adana, it felt like a cruel test of fate. Her lips parted, trembling as if words could not find their way out. Her fingers shook, and her knees threatened to give way. It would have been so easy, to nod, to accept the hand stretched before her, and to escape the poverty that had chained her all her life. But Adana was not thinking of herself. She was thinking of the weak figure lying just a few meters away, hidden under the bridge, forgotten by the rest of the world. Finally, after what felt like eternity, she shook her head slowly. Her voice, though fragile, was clear enough for the crowd to hear. I can't marry you. I'm sorry." The reaction was immediate. Gasps tore through the air. Someone dropped their phone. A man shouted, "She rejected him." Another muttered, "Even the gods will not believe this." A homeless girl had just turned down Johnson Okaffor, the billionaire who could buy anything, build anything, and command anything. Even Johnson himself froze, his jaw tightening, his hand holding the velvet box trembling slightly. This was not the response he had prepared himself for. He had expected tears, perhaps hesitation, but not outright rejection. Struggling to control his voice, he looked up at her. "Why?" he asked softly, almost pleading. "Why would you say no, Adana? What reason could possibly be greater than everything I am offering you?" Adana's eyes welled with tears as she slowly lifted her hand and pointed to a dark corner under the bridge. The crowd followed her gaze. There, lying on a flattened carton, was a frail woman whose breathing came in shallow gasps. Her skin was pale, her lips cracked, her body weakened by illness. That was her mother, Madame Sandra, the only family Adana had left in the world. "That is my mother," Adana whispered, her voice breaking with grief. "She's all I have. She is sick, dying. I beg every day just to buy her food and medicine. You ask me to leave with you? How can I? How can I walk away while she lies here like this? No, I cannot. I will not leave her." A heavy silence blanketed the crowd. The honking cars, the muttering traders, the restless footsteps, all faded, until nothing remained but the sound of her trembling voice. Some people wiped their eyes, others shook their heads in disbelief. For the first time in years, even Johnson's own eyes glistened with unshed tears. For a brief moment, Johnson remained kneeling, his eyes locked on the frail woman lying in the shadows of the bridge. The murmurs of the crowd echoed around him, but he heard none of it. Instead, he felt something inside his chest, something he had not felt in years. A sharp, human ache. He had built an empire of steel and glass, surrounded himself with power, wealth, and beauty. But none of those things had ever made his heart feel as heavy as it did now. He saw not just a sick woman. He saw suffering, neglect, and the raw truth of a world he had long ignored from the comfort of his mansions. Without another word, Johnson closed the velvet box and rose to his feet. The crowd assumed it was over, that he would walk away in anger or humiliation. Some even smirked, whispering, "He will leave her now. He will not stay." But what Johnson did next stunned every single person. He turned from Adana and strode directly toward the frail figure lying on the carton. Kneeling once more, he slid his strong arms beneath the woman's fragile body and lifted her as though she weighed nothing at all. Gasps rippled through the gathering. No one had expected the billionaire, dressed in his immaculate suit, to carry a sick, homeless woman in his arms. Adana covered her mouth with both hands, tears spilling down her cheeks as she whispered, "Mama?" The crowd grew restless, their phones flashing, their voices trembling with awe. Johnson's voice cut through the air, firm and unshakable. "Adana," he said, turning his head slightly toward her, "get in the car. We are going to the hospital. Your mother will not die here, not while I am alive." The people standing around erupted with fresh gasps. Some clapped their hands against their heads in disbelief, while others muttered, "This is not ordinary. This is something else entirely." For once, Lagos seemed united in shock. A billionaire had knelt before a homeless girl, been rejected, and now he was carrying her dying mother toward salvation. Adana hesitated, her body frozen in place. The sight was too overwhelming, too unbelievable. But when Johnson began walking, steadily toward the waiting Rolls-Royce, she found her strength and rushed after him, clutching her dress as tears blurred her vision. The car door swung open with a soft click, and in moments, Johnson laid Madame Sandra carefully across the leather seats. He motioned for Adana to get in, then climbed in himself, his face set with determination. The engine roared to life, and the Phantom glided away from the underbridge, leaving the stunned crowd behind in a haze of disbelief and whispered prayers. For those who had witnessed the scene, the story would live forever. Some shook their heads, muttering, "God works in mysterious ways." Others whispered, "Today, we have seen grace with our own eyes." But for Johnson, Adana, and Madame Sandra, the journey was only beginning. As the car sped through the chaotic streets of Lagos toward the Federal Medical Center, a strange silence filled the cabin. Adana clutched her mother's hand, whispering broken prayers, while Johnson stared ahead, his jaw tight, his heart pounding with an unfamiliar urgency. For once, business deals and board meetings felt irrelevant. All that mattered was the frail life lying in his car and the desperate hope that he had not acted too late. The Rolls-Royce glided through Lagos traffic like a ship cutting through stormy waters, but inside the car, the silence was deafening. Adana held her mother's fragile hand, whispering prayers through trembling lips, her tears soaking the back of her mother's palm. Johnson sat opposite them, his usual calm replaced by something raw and urgent. His heart pounded in a way he had not felt in years. Not in the heat of negotiations, not in billion-dollar mergers, not even during corporate wars. This was different. This was life itself, slipping away before his eyes. By the time they arrived at the Federal Medical Center, Adana's mother was nearly unconscious. Johnson didn't wait for drivers or assistants. He leapt from the car, scooped her into his arms once again, and stormed through the hospital's wide glass doors. The sterile smell of disinfectant hit them instantly, but there was no time to think. "Doctor," Johnson's commanding voice thundered across the emergency ward. "We need help immediately." Nurses and patients turned, their eyes widening as they recognized the man now standing in their midst. Some whispered, "That's Johnson Okaffor," while others gasped at the sight of the frail woman in his arms. Within seconds, a stretcher was rushed forward, and Johnson gently laid Madame Sandra down. Adana clung to her mother's side, sobbing, her lips forming broken pleas. "Please don't die, Mama. Please stay with me." The doctors moved quickly, examining her, shouting medical instructions. But then, a phrase escaped their lips that made Adana's blood run cold. "We need to admit her to the intensive care unit, immediately." The attending nurse hesitated as she glanced at Adana's torn dress and bare feet. It was clear the young girl could not afford even the most basic medical bill. The hesitation turned into a pause, and that pause was unbearable. But before Adana could speak, Johnson's deep, steady voice filled the room. "Do everything you can. Spare no expense. Her bills are on me." The nurse froze, then nodded quickly, her doubts vanishing. Within moments, a team of doctors wheeled Sandra toward the ICU. Adana tried to follow, but a nurse held her back gently. She collapsed against the wall, trembling, tears soaking her face. Johnson stood beside her, his hand hovering for a moment before resting firmly on her shoulder. His voice was softer now, but just as powerful. "She will get the best treatment. I promise you, Adana. She will not be abandoned." Word spread like wildfire through the hospital corridors. Patients, nurses, and even the security guards whispered the unbelievable story. The billionaire who had carried a dying woman into their midst, demanding she be treated as though she were royalty. Some shook their heads in wonder, others smiled with awe, and a few muttered prayers of gratitude. For Adana, the moment felt surreal. Only an hour ago, she had been beneath a bridge, clutching bread rolls, her world defined by hunger and despair. Now she was in a hospital corridor, watching her mother vanish into a ward surrounded by machines and doctors. All because of a man she barely knew, a man whose life was galaxies away from hers. The corridors of the Federal Medical Center smelled of antiseptic and despair. For Adana, time lost all meaning as days blurred into nights, and nights dragged into mornings filled with the same question: would her mother survive? She barely left the ICU door, clutching her tattered shawl around her thin shoulders, her eyes swollen from tears and sleeplessness. Every beep from the machines inside made her heart lurch, and every nurse who stepped out with a clipboard sent her racing forward, only to be told, "We are doing everything we can." Yet she was not alone. To her surprise, Johnson remained. He did not vanish after paying the bills, nor did he retreat to the world of limousines and skyscrapers. Instead, he sat quietly in the waiting area, his tailored suit replaced by simpler clothes, his golden wristwatch removed as though even time itself was irrelevant in those halls. He answered phone calls sparingly, speaking only when necessary, and though his assistants rushed in with files and documents, he waved them away. "Not now," he would say firmly. "This is more important." At first, Adana avoided him. She was too overwhelmed, too consumed by fear for her mother. But slowly, she noticed things. She noticed how he stood every time a doctor passed by, his eyes sharp with questions. She noticed how he paced the corridor at night when she had fallen asleep on the hard bench, and how, when she woke up with shivers, she sometimes found a blanket draped gently over her shoulders, one she knew she hadn't carried there herself. It was strange. This man, whose face appeared on business magazines, whose name was spoken with reverence in boardrooms, now looked like just another weary soul waiting for a loved one's life to be saved. For the first time, Adana saw not the billionaire, but the man. On the third night, as Adana sat with her hands clasped in prayer, Johnson approached quietly and lowered himself onto the bench beside her. "She's strong," he said softly. "Stronger than she looks. She will fight through this." Adana glanced at him, her eyes red and tired. "You don't understand," she whispered. "She's all I have. If I lose her, I lose everything." Johnson looked at her, and something unspoken flickered in his gaze. "Then you will not lose her," he said firmly, as though his words could shape reality itself. The following morning, the doctor emerged with cautious optimism. "She is responding to treatment. The crisis is passing. With continued care, she has a good chance of recovery." Relief washed over Adana like rain on parched earth. She collapsed onto her knees, sobbing with gratitude, whispering prayers of thanks. Johnson's lips curved into the faintest smile, though his eyes betrayed his exhaustion. That day marked a turning point. Though Sandra remained in the ICU, her survival was no longer a question of if, but when. And through it all, Johnson stayed by Adana's side, no longer a stranger, no longer a distant billionaire, but a man whose presence began to feel like an anchor in her storm. By the end of the second week, Madame Sandra's condition improved. The color slowly returned to her cheeks, her breathing grew stronger, and the dullness in her eyes began to fade. She was still weak, but no longer teetering on the edge of death. Nurses who had once rushed in with urgency now entered with calm smiles, adjusting her IV drips and checking her vitals with reassurance. For Adana, every small sign of progress felt like a miracle. She would hold her mother's hand and whisper, "Mama, you're going to be okay. We're going to be okay." Sandra, though frail, was fully aware of the man who made her survival possible. One morning, as Johnson entered the ward with a bouquet of white lilies, Sandra motioned for him to come closer. Her voice was soft, raspy, yet filled with conviction. "Sir, you saved my life. A woman like me, who had nothing. I owe every breath I take now to you." Johnson shook his head, pulling a chair beside her bed. "No, Mama," he replied gently. "It was not me. It was your daughter's strength. She chose you over everything, even when the world thought she was a fool. She is the one who saved you." Sandra's gaze shifted to Adana, who sat quietly at the foot of the bed. Tears welled in the older woman's eyes as she whispered, "I raised you well, my child." Adana lowered her head, embarrassed but deeply moved. For the first time in years, She felt her mother's words not as a burden of expectation, but as a warm embrace. Outside the hospital walls, however, the story had already taken a life of its own. Lagos thrived on gossip, and this tale was too extraordinary to remain hidden. Street vendors told it with wide eyes, embellishing every detail. "Did you hear? The billionaire proposed to a homeless girl under the bridge, and she refused," one would say, while another added, "Not only that, he carried her sick mother to the hospital himself." By the time the story reached the newspapers, it had become a citywide legend. Headlines screamed, "Billionaire humbled by beggar girl's refusal," and "Love or madness? Lagos billionaire risks all for a street girl." Reactions were mixed. Some admired Johnson's compassion, calling it a divine act of kindness. "At last, a rich man who remembers the poor," they said, praising him as a hero. Others mocked him, whispering that he had lost his mind. "How can a man of his stature stoop so low? Has he gone mad for a girl in rags?" Boardrooms buzzed with speculation. Investors whispered doubts, and even politicians debated whether this new chapter in Johnson's life would strengthen or tarnish his legacy. Through it all, Johnson remained unmoved. He continued visiting the hospital, sitting beside Adana and her mother as though the outside world did not exist. For him, the whispers of the city were nothing compared to the quiet gratitude in Sandra's smile, or the unspoken trust growing in Adana's eyes. Yet deep down, Adana could not silence the question gnawing at her heart. Why? Why would a man like him, a billionaire who could have any woman, live any life, choose to stay beside her? She wondered, but she dared not ask. Not yet. 3 weeks after being admitted, Madame Sandra was finally strong enough to leave the ICU. Her steps were shaky, her frame still frail, but the doctors assured her recovery would continue as long as she received proper care. The day of her discharge, nurses and patients gathered around quietly, their eyes following the unusual trio. The once homeless mother and daughter walking out of the ward, supported on either side by a billionaire in plain clothes. To the staff, the sight was both strange and inspiring. It was not every day that wealth and poverty walked side by side, bound not by business or charity, but by something deeper. At the hospital entrance, a sleek black SUV waited. Johnson had arranged everything: medication, follow-up visits, even a private nurse who would check in daily. Adana stood in stunned silence, unsure how to respond to such generosity. She wanted to protest, to tell him he had already done more than enough, but each time the words rose to her lips, she saw the quiet determination in his eyes, the kind of determination that allowed no argument. As they drove away, Sandra leaned back against the seat, her hand resting on her daughter's. "Adana," she murmured, her voice filled with gratitude, "God has sent an angel to us." Adana swallowed, hard, her gaze shifting toward Johnson. "He's not an angel, Mama. He's a man. A man who, for some reason, decided to help us." Johnson, hearing her words, smiled faintly but said nothing. He simply stared out the window as the busy streets of Lagos rolled past. For him, the decision was not one born of charity or guilt. It was something else, something he could not yet define. When they arrived beneath the bridge where Adana and her mother once slept, Sandra stopped abruptly. She shook her head. "We cannot stay here anymore. Not after everything." The words were laced with shame, as though the bridge itself had betrayed her. Johnson's voice was calm, steady. "You will not stay here again. I have already made arrangements." To Adana's astonishment, he led them to a modest but well-kept apartment, not far from the city center. The building was simple, painted cream with iron railings and flowering plants lining the small balconies. It was no mansion, but to Adana, it looked like paradise. Tears blurred her eyes as she stepped inside. Clean floors, running water, a proper bed, and a kitchen where her mother could finally cook again. Sandra lowered herself onto the bed, overwhelmed. "Sir," she whispered, "we can never repay you." Johnson shook his head gently. "This is not about repayment. It's about dignity. Everyone deserves at least this much." In the days that followed, Johnson visited often. Sometimes he brought groceries, sometimes books, and sometimes nothing but his company. Slowly, Adana began to notice that his presence no longer felt like intrusion, but comfort. The walls she had built around her heart, walls forged by years of struggle and mistrust, began to crack, though she fought to keep them standing. For the first time in her life, Adana wondered if destiny was weaving a story far greater than anything she had ever dared to imagine. Life in the small apartment soon settled into a rhythm. Sandra grew stronger each day, moving from her bed to the kitchen, smiling more often, her laughter returning in small bursts that warmed the home. Adana devoted herself to her mother, but she could not deny the presence that lingered at the edges of their new life. Johnson. He came without fanfare, sometimes staying only a few minutes, sometimes sitting quietly for hours. He never imposed, never demanded gratitude, yet his very existence within their world felt like both a gift and a mystery. One evening, after Sandra had gone to rest, Adana stepped out to the balcony. The city stretched before her, alive with honking cars, glowing billboards, and the hum of restless energy. She leaned against the railing, her thoughts a tangle of gratitude, confusion, and fear. That was when she heard his voice behind her. "You don't trust me yet, do you?" Johnson's tone was calm, not accusatory, but probing in its honesty. Adana turned, startled. He stood in the doorway, his figure silhouetted against the warm light of the living room. For a moment she struggled for words. "It's not that I don't trust you," she admitted softly. "It's that I don't understand you. Men like you don't do this. You don't give homes to girls from the street, or save their mothers, or sit in hospitals for weeks. People like you, they walk past us." Johnson stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Perhaps people like me should have stopped walking past a long time ago." His words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Adana felt her chest tighten. "But why me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why us?" For the first time, Johnson's carefully guarded composure cracked. His eyes softened. His voice dropped low, and every syllable carried a weight that made Adana's heart race. "Because the first time I saw you, standing there under that bridge, refusing me despite everything I had to offer, I realized you were unlike anyone I had ever met. You reminded me of something I had forgotten, that there are still people in this world who cannot be bought. And in that moment, Adana, you became more than just a girl to me. You became the truth I had been searching for." Her breath caught. She had expected kindness, perhaps even pity, but not this, not a confession that trembled at the edge of vulnerability. Her heart waged war with her mind. A part of her wanted to believe him, to lean into the warmth of his words. But another part screamed warnings. Men like him belonged to another world, and she had spent her whole life surviving in the shadows of a world that had no place for her. "I don't know if I can believe that," she whispered, turning her face away. Johnson stepped closer, his voice steady but tender. "Then don't believe my words. Believe my actions. Watch me. Test me. If I fail you, then send me away. But if I don't, then maybe, just maybe, you'll see that I am not here out of charity, but out of something far stronger." The silence that followed was thick, filled with unspoken questions and fragile possibilities. Adana's heart pounded as she stood frozen, caught between fear and hope. And in that quiet moment on the balcony, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which path destiny would unfold before them.